Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night. We welcome you to our event today. I'm Joan Combs-Durso, feminist economist. As a member of the IAFFE Online Events Committee, I'm delighted to welcome you to our panel event today. The Online Events Committee organizes and enjoys virtual gatherings that bring together feminist economists and scholars from other fields, practitioner professionals, activists, students, and everyone interested for informative and engaging conversations. From formal panels and informal fireside chats to hands-on workshops and networking events, we extend IAFFE's reach beyond the journal, the listservs, and the conferences to you. We're fortunate to be working with the IAFFE Young Scholars, so we are indeed a multi-generational group. Each year, the committee adopts a theme or themes. The last workshop was part of the Bridges theme, bridging disciplines, bridging communities. As a grad student in economics, I heard that economists don't gather primary data, but often use the data gathered by others, particularly governments, to build our models. It had to be models, and it had to be quantitative. Today's young economists have a treasure trove of tools incorporating new technologies with methodologies shared from other disciplines. Today's the first event in our new methodology series. Feminist economists and academia often exists in economics departments that aren't focused on our specific interests. We all use the same economist tools, but interpret them differently with a different focus on women and their multiple roles across all of our societies, on power dynamics, and on our agency in the world. Occasionally, we're even encouraged to explore other disciplines, but only if we publish in the right journals, using the right methods that are recognized by the right gatekeepers. The journal Feminist Economics has gone a long way towards making more welcoming landing place for feminist economists and scholars in related fields. Future events of our theme on methodologies will explore reproducibility, citation and gatekeeping, statistical software tools, what we're using, what we actually need, what we hope to use, qualitative methods from many different disciplines, and the practice of research team management, among other topics. Before I turn this over to Shraddha, I would like to call you to participate in the chat today. Our session is, by the way, being recorded. Participate in the events that we have. Participate in the online conversations. IAFFE members, look out for information from GHE, and everyone, we encourage you to come to the conference in Geneva or virtually in June. The last thing I'd ask for is give us your ideas. Help us organize or take on organizing an event. We'll help. Let us know what your dream event would be that we can only achieve together online. Mayra Jain, who is one of our young scholars, has put together this first panel on our primary tool, data, in all of its forms.
Thanks, Joan. Thank you so much for introducing the theme for today. And warm welcome to everybody. We are extremely thankful to the audience and to our panelists for joining us today. So we have 4 speakers today, and it's my honor to introduce them to our audience. First, we have Dr. Mayra Booney. She is a senior fellow with Data 2X at the Center for Global Development. Previously, she was Director for Gender and Development at the World Bank. She also worked at the Inter-American Development Bank, where she headed the Social Development Division. She was also the founding member of the International Center for Research for Women. We are delighted to have you here. Next, we have Dr. Deviki Jain, who was the founder of the Institute of Social Studies Trust in New Delhi and founding member of Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. She has also received Civilian Award from Government of India for her contribution to social justice and empowerment of women. Recently, she has authored her fascinating memoir titled The Brass Notebook, A Member. Welcome, Dr. Devaki, to this panel. I'm also pleased to invite Professor Irene Van Stavarin. She's a professor of pluralist development economics at Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University, Rotterdam. She has a wide range of publications on the themes of feminist economics, social economics, institutional economics, and post-Keynesian economics. She's a project leader on the online database called Indices of Social Development. She has authored several books, and most recent ones being Alternative Ideas from 10 Almost Forgotten Economists and Economics After the Crisis, and Introduction to Economics from Pluralist and Global Perspective. Welcome to you too. It's my pleasure to introduce Sharda Srinivasan. She's Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Gender, Justice and Development and University of Guelph. She's also the Director of Canada-India Research Center for Learning and Engagement. Her research is located within the broad field of gender and development and has a strong focus on social justice, sex ratio imbalance, gender discrimination, youth, and farming. She has co-edited a book titled Scarce Women and Surplus Men in China and India, Macro Demographics versus Local Dynamics. Thank you all for joining us today. So we get started. I will quickly put forward the questions we had for our panelists, and then it will be great to hear more about their work. So we shared the following questions with our panelists to reflect on. So it goes as follows. Sharing your research experience about collection and analysis of data on gender relations. What are the challenges that you have faced in your own work while using existing data sources? And what methods have you used to collect data that has been suitable for your research? Kindly reflect on the way forward too. Have you ever faced challenges or questions about rigor of the data collection method used? And lastly, how can quantitative and qualitative methods be complementary to each other? Based on these, I request the speakers to reflect on their work. We will have about 12 to 15 minutes for each speaker, and then we will open up for questions and discussion, which will be for about 30 minutes. So let's get started. Dr. Mayra, over to you.
Thank you so much. And it's such a great pleasure. You cannot believe what a great pleasure it is, particularly to see colleagues like Devaki that I haven't seen in a very, very long time. So without further ado, let me just go. And what I'm going to be talking a bit about is, I think, a big part of data on gender relations is to debias the data that currently exists. And what do you do? How do you handle that? Another thing that I want to talk about is having the data, but the data, all the data that we're collecting needs to be used. If it's not used, there's no purpose in collecting the data. So I'm going to base my talk on very, very old work that I did when I was at the International Center for Research on Women, and current work that we are doing at Data2X, that is a data alliance based at the UN Foundation. And I'm going to tackle two issues. The one is data on work and employment, and the second one is about data that is there, but it's not being used. And I would love to talk about a third issue, that is the famous data on female-headed households, the concept of female-headed household data, but I don't think we can leave that for next time. So on work and employment, more about 40 years ago, maybe, when I was just at ICRW, I was asked to go and evaluate and integrate women into an integrated rural development project that was taking place in Honduras. And, I went sort of all bright and eyed, and I say, well, how we can integrate women's activities into this project. And I got there, and, I thought they told me, well, women are at home, they're home producers, that's what they're doing. And in fact, I went around and there were no women at home. These were 3 provinces in the middle of Honduras. They're agricultural provinces. They grow tobacco and they grow coffee plantations, big time. And then I went around and what did I find? You know, women were working alongside the men in the tobacco plantations and in the coffee farms. You went, and then I went into the agricultural census of Honduras of that year. And you know what happened? Sort of all the labor force for the census that was set there was mostly male. There were very few women counted as workers in the agricultural labor force. So what I did is instead, you know, and here's qualitative methods, I went to the farms, I went to the tobacco plantations, and I went to the coffee farms and started counting and asking people, how many people are working here? You know, and counting the women and the men. And it was clear, 90% of the work in picking the coffee beans was done by women and children. But it was the family that was going to the workplace, and obviously, you know, it was the male, the head of the family's work that was counted. The family workers, women and children, were not. Then in the tobacco plantations, you know, you get sort of a lot of the work is pulling out the tobacco leaves and deveining the tobacco leaves in the tobacco farms. That was women's work. Why? And they told me, well, because, you know, women have more skill at deveining the tobacco. Basically, they were hiring young women workers. It was illegal to hire young women workers, so they were not reporting them. About 40% of the production of tobacco at that time in Honduras was done by women. So there was huge undercounting of farming work, of women's farm work. Because why? Because this work is seasonal, because it was illegal, some of it, because they were hiring young people, because it was family working in the coffee plantations, but they were only taking the work of men. And so it's the whole issue of how you measure, right, subsistence production and agricultural work. So let's move fast forward many decades. Finally, in 2013, the International Conference of Labor Statisticians made a resolution to solve this problem of undercounting of women's work. And they came up with ICLS 19, the International Conference of Labor Statistics, where they redefined the concepts of work and employment. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but anyway, what they decided to do is they decided to, in order to better count the unpaid and underpaid and the seasonal work that mostly women do, they separated the concepts. One was they left employment only for work for pay or profit. The rest of the work became work, a big category of work, and that includes volunteer work, but it includes also work in own use production of goods and services. So, you know, in theory, so, and then, you know, the ILO obviously asks countries to start using these new definitions of work and employment. In theory, this is going to really now count all the unpaid and underpaid of work of all those that are working in subsistence production, right? And in home production. In reality, though, what this is probably, unless, you know, if countries, in fact, start using the new classifications and start deciding that, okay, they're going to count both work and employment. But what if countries decide, okay, we're going to use our new definitions of employment, but they don't immediately start counting work also as well. And what happens? The concept of the new definitions of employment restricts the concept of employment to work for pay or profit and drops out of the labor force subsistence production. So I think that a big issue is, what do these new definitions, how they're implemented, how countries count things, and what are the implications for policy? If in fact countries start using the new definitions but do not use them precisely in the way that ILO wants them to be used. So what we did with Data2X, and very concerned particularly in this transition between the old definitions and the new definitions, that a lot of the labor force that was subsistence production, that was women's labor force, would be undercounted. We just recently did 4 case studies in Cote d'Ivoire, Laos PDR, Myanmar, and Rwanda, and you can all find them in the Data2X website. And these are countries that are using the new definitions of work and employment. And what we're finding when you compare the old definitions with the new definitions, the only country where the proportions of women and men in the labor force with the new definitions versus the old do not change is Myanmar. But in Cote d'Ivoire, in Laos PDR, and in Rwanda, with the new definitions, a significant proportion of the women who used to be in the labor force as subsistence producers now are dropped of the labor force, and the labor force shrinks. So because sort of the women move into this category of work, and work is not being counted. So one of the things that, this is one of the things that Rwanda now is doing, for instance. In Rwanda, for instance, women and men were counted at about 84% of the women were in the labor force, and 85% of the men were in the labor force with the old definitions. With the new definitions, 20 percentage point of women's in the labor force drops out. So Rwanda is now trying to teach, and inform policymakers of what this transition into the new definitions mean, so that people will still devise policies for those people that now are in subsistence production but are not counted under employment. But the point being that it is incredibly important sort of to educate the policymakers, particularly when you're making these dramatic changes in the definitions of work. Do I have, how much time else do I, how much time more do I have?
Maybe a couple of minutes.
Okay, so the other thing that we are very concerned about now at Data2X is the amount of data that is available on gender relations, but it's not being used. And what we have been doing, we have been working a lot. We have a Women's Financial Inclusion Data Partnership, where we're trying to get data on financial inclusion, both on the demand side. On the demand side, there is quite a bit of data from FinScope and Findex and other surveys, but also data on the supply side, data that banks and financial institutions produce regularly through administrative data. That is the kind of data that we assumed was not being generated, and it's incredibly important in order to define the right policies for financial inclusion for women. You need data on the need of women for financial services, but you certainly also need data on the supply side. And I will give you just a very small example. For instance, data on the demand side in Mexico. On the demand side, the gender gap in financial inclusion over the years closed dramatically. And women and men had the same number of banks accounts, and it closed in the last 5 or 10 years. But you have to have data on the supply side. When you went to see what was happening on the supply side, and these are data from banks, you saw that that the closing of the gap was explained because women had become the major clients of the national banks. And what was this? Because they were having accounts through the cash transfer programs. So they were accounts that were automatically opened by the government that gave cash transfers to the women. In the commercial banking sector, the gender gap remained dramatically, high. So the issue here being that if you don't have the supply side data, you don't know what is happening really to financial inclusion of women, and you don't know what are the challenges and the problems that women have in accessing financial services. So we have just done, and we are completing studies on 6 countries where we have been going down and doing diagnostics on the supply side and the demand side for financial services. They include Nigeria, Kenya, Pakistan, whatever. And the surprising thing that we have found is that the data on the supply side is there. There is sex disaggregated data, but the banks are not using it. And why are the reasons for not using of the data? One, and a very basic one, is that the banks still don't see the business case for using this kind of data. So I think I end up with a real plea that as much as it is important to produce the right kind of data on gender relations, right, and unbiased data, we also need to spend a lot more time working on the bridge between data producers and policymakers, and starts to see that the data on gender is used. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mayra. It's so important to look at how definitions play out and to bring together different sources of data to analyze phenomena. Now we move on to Dr. Deviki. You also have about 12 to 15 minutes, and I'll try to prompt about 10 to 11 minutes so that we are on time. And yeah, Jihi, will you please put on the tables in a couple of minutes? Yeah, thank you. Dr. Devaki?
Yeah, I'll start. I'm just wondering, have I done the right thing?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, everything is good. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I've called what I want to talk about as improving data collection for gendered analysis. And in my journey on improving, rectifying the data on women as workers, I started with the research using time use. This was 1975, and I was fortunate to get the support of the Indian Council of Social Science Research. But I started out of curiosity because the official data showed women's participation rate very low, 27%. But as you would have realized, as you ride through any roads in developing countries, women are always bending and working on something or the other. So I thought that this data should be revealed correctly. So the official figure was given as 27%, and I let the cat out of the bag. By the time we finished the study, we found it was 33%. So how to do this? I decided to partner with the National Statistical Organization so that we have a comparison between the macro and what I do, so we can leap on it. Otherwise, when we do these academic studies, they just remain in academic journals. So it is a form of advocacy or lobbying to work with them. So the National Sample Survey Organization was conducting what was called the 32nd round on household sample survey. You might have heard about it. If not, I don't want to take your time to tell you that every 5 years, India's Statistical Office does a household survey to collect the data on labor, employment, men, women. Now, I managed to persuade the chairman of the NSSO, and I'm mentioning this for other students and others who want to do such studies. It's very important to see if you can work in partnership with the macro data so that you don't have to submit to them, but you say, look, you have it like this, but I found it like this. That helps to do what is called lobbying, change the methodology. So I managed to get partnership. And of course, as I told you, the primary objective was to state the hypothesis that women's participation rate is much lower in what's it called, the macro data. And the other was to identify the various determinants of female labor supply. And the third was to regroup productive and non-productive activities and define gainful activity on the basis of the evidence. I don't know how many other countries use this word, but in India, the word gainful activity is used for what we call economically valuable work. As I already mentioned in the beginning, I'm not with the current trend to expand the concept of economy to include care work, or traditionally we used to call the 3 C's: cooking, cleaning, and caring for the child. This has been something that the UN has been doing in New York, and I find it's distracting us in the developing countries from getting at the heart of what we want, which is to understand the women who are working on fields and farms and industries and who are not recognized and not paid. So we chose for this study 2 agroclimatic regions, and I want to tell you that Naila Kabir and one else are trying to go back to the same villages to see how it's changed. So we chose two regions for agroclimatic differences: West Bengal for wet cultivation and Uttar Pradesh for dry cultivation, because it does make a difference what crop you grow, and what crop you grow makes a difference to what labor you use. So there's a connection between weather, climate, crop, and gender allocation according to as workers. In West Bengal, in tour, we observed that individuals were doing about getting up at 7 to 8 in the morning, and the children also were working for many more hours. And so we found that we could challenge the NSSO. Our table also laid to rest, there was a perception even by the NSSO that in Bengal, in West Bengal, women do not like to go into labor, that the men insist that they stay home because they should not be exposed to the public. That was all. I didn't want to use the word like bullshit, but we found that when we collected the data, that was not the case. The women were slogging, but they were slogging inside the house. So disgusting. I mean, they were allowed to work inside the house, but not outside, but they were still adding to what we call the GDP. In the study that we then published for the large and discussed with the National Sample Survey, we found another interesting finding, which I would like to share with all of you, that if you divide the work participation rate of women and men according to class, and I used class 2 indicators. One was ownership of any asset, land, anything, and the other was just income. I mean, in India, the landless are the poorest, so they have no asset at all. So you took the assetless, and then I went all the way up to the big farmers. And you will be not surprised to see that in the lowest income, that is those who are assetless, women's work participation rate was much higher than other classes. So the poor women labor almost to 72% was the participation rate compared to men, which is 40. That's another hypothesis that I like to share, and I hope many of you will agree, that women are driven to bring some income into the household. They are kind of driven to feed and subsist the family servant. It's the most moving, sad thing to see how much they strain themselves just to bring wherewithal to the household. So that was proved by the participation rate. I don't know whether you want to see the table. Have you put the table on, Shraddha? This is work participation rate by land classes. Can you see here? Landless males, females 74, landless G16 female. You see the landless, the women are more engaged in income work than men. This I push this all the time whenever I speak, because I like to show that poor women are desperately in need of income and they work. Is there only one table, Shraddha? Yeah. Then this was work participation, no land, not even homes in land. You can see landless males 70.8, females 30. This is in West Bengal. West Bengal is terrible. They don't allow the women to come out. The next table, please. Rajasthan.
That's both of them that are
Oh,
here.
it's done. Okay. So my goal, and therefore was only to transform the national sample survey. It was the dialogue between researchers, micro researchers, and the macro data collection. There was no other point to prove. So to show that female work participation rate was much higher than what the national data said by looking at time they spend and on economic activity. And we did that study in many other places. We did the National Dairy Development Board. You must have heard of the Amul Milk Project. Went to all those places. We found that women were working from 4 in the morning to 11 in the night. And the death rate amongst reproductive age was higher than ever. They were working themselves to death. So such data helps in changing policy. We were able to change the policy. We were able to get those women veterinary help the doorstep by talking to the overall management of the project. So I'd like to end with that by saying that work participation rate can be got together, challenging the national system by doing time use studies, short and dirty studies, then taking it up to policy.
Thank you. Your example for Amul cooperative is very important, like how time use study can bring about change in the local setups too. Thank you. Now I invite Professor Irene to make a presentation.
Thank you very much. I tried to stick to your questions, Shraddha. And you indicated in your email that you wanted to start with a reflection on our own research. But after that, you had questions. So what do you want me to do?
Maybe you can start with the broader questions and then you can draw from your own research. That be
Clever.
That's fine. Yeah. Okay. So the question about my research experience in data collection and analysis on gender relations at the macro level, I think there is some good data at the cross-country level if you want to do cross-country analysis, which is what we like to do in macroeconomic analysis. Not only gender disaggregated data, but also data about gendered institutions. And I particularly like the CG data collected by OECD, the development department of the OECD. And they collect the data every couple of years. So not for every year, but that's logical because institutions don't change that quickly over time. But I really like and also use this CG, social institutions of gender inequality data. At the same time, they lack information about time use, individual income, and what also would be very helpful, not only for micro analysis within a country, but also for cross-country analysis, is to have some data about gender relations in the household, like income differences between men and women, educational differences between men and women. And we have, of course, macro level country data for the educational level of women and the educational level of men in terms of enrollment, school diplomas, primary, secondary, tertiary. But we don't know this at the household level. How big is the gap? And in some countries, also including developing countries, women on average attain a higher level of education than men for the younger age groups. Does that make a difference? in things like their income, their female labor force participation rate, their bargaining power, political positions, breaking the glass ceiling, and so on. We don't know because we don't have the data. At the micro level, particularly this household level data, as was already referred to, we need much, much more. Referring to my own experience, a couple of years ago, I collected data from an online care work platform. So a platform where people can supply domestic work and customers demand domestic work for a formal wage. Well, wage, there's no wage relationship, but formal market-based price in the Netherlands. And actually, I found this a very useful way of collecting microdata because it helped me to do a class-based analysis, because there's a clear mutually exclusive set of categories: households that supply domestic work and households that demand domestic work. Hence, I was able to classify them as two social classes. And I looked at the explanatory variable was the share and the hours of unpaid work in households by men. And interestingly, it was the lower class men, that is the male partners of women who do domestic work in other women's households. These men put in more unpaid work than the higher class men, because the higher class men had the escape of hiring domestic workers because of their higher income. And in particularly, the econometrics showed because of the higher income of the female partners. So there was an irony as well in the analysis. In terms of challenges that I face in my own work with using existing data sources and methods to collect data, but I think, again, the key challenge is to have good time use data, time use for all kinds of activities beyond the binary of work and non-work, or employment and non-employment. We need this for men and women in hours, in shares of work, also for age groups. Shraddha and me, together with Karin Asset-Siegman, are working with an interesting data set from India, in which we also include work time by girls and boys, for example. When we have these data, sometimes for some countries, the problem is that you can't do a cross-country analysis because you have just very, very few countries in your data set. Now, one way I was able to solve this issue is by including a gender equality index, GEI, in my own database that I coordinate at the ISS. It's a database called Indices of Social Development. It's freely available online. It includes 6 indices of social development, including gender equality. And it is the method that we use that is quite innovative. Of course, I did not invent it myself, but the method helps to construct an index at a country level from a variety of underlying indicators, but you don't need to have data on all the indicators. So every country appears in the index ranking as soon as it has data for at least 3 variables. And for the gender equality index, we have more than 20 variables. So every country that has data for at least 3 out of these over 20 variables appears in the ranking. And so we don't take averages, but we use a ranking method using the statistical bootstrapping method. So we rank countries 1,000 times until there's a stable ranking of countries. And some countries have data for 3 countries, others for 10, others for 20, others for 5. But it gives a huge list of countries. We have data for over 200 countries in that index. So yeah, that was a statistical way to address one of the problems, but certainly not all of the problems. Yeah, there's a question, have you faced challenges or questions about rigor? Well, for this ranking method, it's a ranking method, right? So it doesn't take averages, it's a ranking method, which makes it more difficult to use it for time series analysis. On the other hand, we have so many countries included that the ranking is not so much influenced by having a few countries more or less from one year to the other. A final thing I need to say is that I will put this in the chat where you can find the database, is that we collect data every 5 years. So it's not available per year, but every 5 years, also because it includes a lot of qualitative, informal, formal institutions data, which don't change that quickly over time. So let me type the database. There you go. Yeah, the question we got from reviewers on our article on using data from this platform with suppliers and customers of domestic work. We had quite a low number of responses from the suppliers of domestic work. And guess what? These are obviously people who don't have access to internet or don't have computers, who lack time, who are migrants, who don't speak our language. But interestingly, the variable for which we had least data was the estimation of partners' income. And this is, I think, worth a whole study of its own, how it is, why people in precarious work, couples in precarious work, don't have the information about what the other one is earning. Finally, how can quantitative and qualitative methods be complementary to each other? I really like that question as well, Shraddha. I think there are 2 reasons. One is triangulation, because both quantitative and qualitative methods are not perfect. Each has their limitations, so it's good to use them both. But sometimes it goes further. Sometimes one method can actually deliver information in order to improve the results of the other method. And let me give an example from a PhD student that I supervised a couple of years ago from Ethiopia. And she worked with the Ethiopia Demographic and Health Survey, and her question was broadly about women's decision-making power in households in rural Ethiopia. And she felt that she was missing something in defining and explaining bargaining power. Then she did a couple of focus group interviews with women. And then the interesting thing was that several women told her that when they really got a problem with their husband over going out of the house, in the field, or keeping savings, then their elder brother helped them. So we looked into the DHS data about siblings, and we were able to find a variable for male siblings. Age, I was not sure whether we could distinguish between older and younger brothers, but at least it was possible to use that. And indeed, in the econometrics, it turned out to be a statistically significant variable. So that shows that combining qualitative and quantitative research may do even more than simply triangulation. Then I would like also to very briefly discuss the issue of the lacking data on the care economy. because that is a huge stumbling block for feminist economists who want to study not the market, not the labor market, but the largely invisible community economy and care economy. And what we often kind of resort to is time use data. But still, with time use data, you do not necessarily have all the dimensions of caring and community cooperation. So, for example, a recent study on worker cooperatives in various countries showed that worker cooperatives, as compared to standard private for-profit companies, were more resilient in the face of the global epidemic. Well, that's interesting. But then I would like to know why. How is that possible? What is that cooperative dimension? Is there a caring component that makes these cooperative firms more resilient? And so a dimension like resilience of the care economy that feminist economists have analyzed to some extent is very difficult to capture with any data that is available. So what I thought is perhaps a direction to go is not only focus on gender when we need data that is relevant for feminist economists, but sometimes we need to look somewhere else. In this case, data on commons, on social cohesion, that's part of the database that I mentioned earlier, or on cooperation. And perhaps a kind of backdoor to find data that is about gender, of course, but then more about the care economy and the community economy. That's it for now.
Thank you so much. The importance of intra-household information is very important to highlight. In all economies, we suffer with this kind of lack of data on intra-household dimensions. Thank you for highlighting that specifically. Now I invite Dr. Sharda to reflect on the topic.
Thanks, Shraddha. You know, I'm often called Shraddha instead of Sharda, and I realized you were being called Sharda instead of Shraddha. So yeah, it is confusing, but yeah, thank you very much for including me in this panel. I'm not a trained economist, and the work I do is related to gender discrimination and gender-based violence in India, but also among the South Asian communities in Canada. To go over the questions that Shraddha asked us to reflect upon, I'm going to use the work that I did in a previous project, which looked at the consequences of daughter deficit, you know, in India and China. So this was a large project that I was part of. Given my work on, you know, daughter discrimination, daughter elimination in India, a colleague in Canada was kind enough to include me in a grant application, which looked at the consequences of daughter deficit. So this was a team looking at China and India. So I was responsible for the India project. And having done quite a bit of work on understanding how daughter elimination emerges in a particular region with very high women's status, and also looking at policies that can be put in place to prevent daughter elimination, I thought it was time to look at the consequences of daughter deficit. So yeah, like all researchers, the starting point was what does existing literature actually say about these issues? And of course, you know, the existing literature were almost exclusively based on macro level data or national and regional data, often imperfect. Looking at sex ratio numbers, those numbers, I think over the years, given the sort of deficits in China and India, those numbers, those data sets are really becoming more and more reliable and really very good, including all sorts of variables that 30 years ago they hadn't included. And then looking at violence against women, levels of gender levels of violence in particular regions. So the narrative ran this way across all of the existing literature that when there is a shortage of women, men are a bit anchorless, so violence against women would increase. So would the level of violence, the gender levels of violence in society. And therefore, you're going to see more terrorists coming from these regions. And you can see why this sort of narrative is so appealing at a macro international level. So I set off to my little village. So I do mostly ethnographic research. So I went off to the village where I had done previous work. And this is located in South India, in Tamil Nadu, where there is a long history of daughter elimination and therefore daughter deficit. So I went about, so this was sort of, a kind of reconnaissance mission, so to speak, where I just wanted to get a sense of how to set up the research and what are the sort of things that I would have to look for. And so, I spent about a week talking to women, men of different age groups, different castes, but also speaking to policymakers, bureaucrats, as well as NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And the young men that I interacted with were constantly saying, we are not getting married because nobody wants to give us a bride, right? So, it's kind of slightly different from what was coming out of the macro level insights, which is there are no brides, right? And then, when I went and interacted with some of the NGOs and I explained to them the research that I was planning to undertake, they basically said, a lot of men in our region are unable to find brides, but that has nothing to do with daughter deficits resulting from daughter elimination. This has to do with HIV/AIDS. And I was like, can you just talk a little bit more about it? So in early 2000s, this particular region where I did the field work, and it is published in the Journal of Migration and Development and the Economic and Political Weekly, for those of you who are interested. In the early 20s, this region had the highest incidence of HIV/AIDS in a national survey done by the government of India. And therefore, this was all over the news. And why the incidence of HIV/AIDS was one of the highest in this region in the country, because truck driving was a very active occupation, largely for men. This region to this day supplies one of the largest number of truck drivers in the country. So therefore, people immediately put these things together and said, we are not going to give our brides to a truck driver or anybody who has had anything to do with truck driving as a profession, right? So the sort of things that I was hearing were really different, right? The macro level existing literature was saying it's all because of daughter deficit. And then the local narratives were really something different. The young men were saying, look, these women are all educated. They don't want me, who is not very well educated, or I'm a farmer, or I'm a truck driver. And then an NGO helped me to get the truck driver narrative into this picture. So of course, as a researcher, it's very tempting to kind of say, here are all of these existing scholarly work that's talking about this problem. And then you're hearing all of this narratives. And that's where, one of the things that I strongly rely on, being neither trained in economics nor in anthropology, is really, you have to listen to the ethnographic voices in yourself, right? So for me there, it was, okay, how do we get all of this together? Because with my previous research, I knew that data deficits, data elimination had to play a role in the sort of situation that that men were experiencing in their inability to find brides, right? But at the same time, there are all of these narratives which are also equally true, right? So how do you piece them together? So the research that I did really is not about dismissing one narrative or the other, but really, showcasing how often local realities are complex and messy, right? And we know this, but yet sometimes when we resort to using large data sets, we are constantly trying to simplify explanations, right? We are trying to look for the one thing or two factors that would explain what is going on, but yeah, that's not the way people's lives are organized. So for those of you who are interested in how all of these things come together, I will put the reference to the article in a moment in the chat. But basically, I found this experience, and I share this very often in the methods class as well, is really to be able to challenge some of the received wisdom and really try and put it in a local context to understand what is going on. And therefore, what is then my contribution through my research is really to offer a more nuanced explanation of a particular phenomenon, right? And I think that really answers a number of questions that Shraddha had asked us to reflect upon, right? And when I took this article for publication, I said, I want to take this to a demographic. I first took it to a development journal because I'm trained in development studies. And the article is called, Between Demographic Deficit and Development Deficit, right? So my pitch was that, here is the demographic phenomenon, but that is indeed a development issue. That is an issue that economists have to be concerned about, development policymakers have to be concerned about, not just demographers or gender specialists, right? So I took it to a top development journal where I had earlier published, and they basically said, this is a demographic thing, so take it to a demographic journal. And I tried, I had a few email exchanges with the editor, and I realized I was not making any progress. So I took it to a demographic journal, and they said, your sample is only 140, and it's not a random survey, so we are unable to publish it. So for me, this interdisciplinary research, which we are all encouraged to do, and I think is super relevant, is fantastic. But the moment you're getting to trying to publish it, right, it's like, you're not checking off this, this is not rigorous enough, or this is not. So there are all of these challenges that we encounter when you're trying to undertake an interdisciplinary mixed methods research. But anyway, it's finally published, and this is one of the works that really led to scholars who work on similar approach to understanding phenomenon. So that led us to the edited book that Shraddha mentioned at while she introduced me, of the sort of macro narratives and the local dynamics in understanding bride shortages and what young men are going through. So moving away, I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about the current research that I am engaged in, which is looking at the extent to which adult married daughters contribute to their parents' well-being in India. Again, tied to son preference and daughter discrimination that I have worked on. Very often people say that we need a son because daughters will marry away and there will be nobody to take care of us. I come from a family of only daughters, and I've often asked myself, I mean, we haven't abandoned our parents just because we got married and went away, right? If anything, I think we are really, because we are not there physically, we try to kind of overcompensate or really be very mindful of our obligations, right? But there is absolutely no data across the Indian data sets undertaken by different organizations. There is a lot of data on elderly care in India, but we will not find data on how much do daughters contribute, how much do sons contribute. So we don't find that at all, right? So this was the challenge. So wherever we went to, even when I was trying to set up the study, so it has a survey component, and it has life histories, in-depth interviews inspired by life histories, in trying to understand how do families with only daughters organize care, elderly care. And we encounter the same thing, right? So when you talk to people, they say, oh, daughters don't care for us after they are married. We will not take any money from daughters. But when I fall sick, it is the daughter who comes to take care. So, how do you then measure a daughter's contribution? Do you measure it financially or in terms of the time and effort she puts in to care? Daughter is calling us, 3 or 4 times a week. Sons don't do it. So we've heard all of this, but this is not captured in any way in any of the existing data systems in India. And that's one of the key things that's emerged from the research that I've been doing with demographers and economists on this subject. And I think I will stop here. Thank you, Shraddha.
Thanks, Sharda. Your insights have been very encouraging for undertaking interdisciplinary research. So looking forward to read more of your work. So let's open up the floor for some questions. I'll request the audience to raise their hands, and if they want, they can put the questions in the chat box too. We will try to coordinate and put them to our panelists. If possible, please direct your questions to the panelists. Otherwise, I request the speakers to respond to the questions. So please feel free to put your questions. Thank you. I'll just quickly see if we have something on the chat. Yes, Raya, please go ahead.
Sorry. Thank you so much. This has been so fascinating. I was just wondering, and perhaps if I need to address my question to one of you, I would just pick perhaps at Mayra, who was emphasizing the fact that there often sort of are gender disaggregated data that we just don't use or we don't have access to. And obviously having leverage as a researcher to extract that data from the businesses who hold it can be tricky. But I wondered if anyone's sort of able to comment either here as the panelists or maybe in the chat about sort of female ownership of sort of more basic goods like account ownership on utility bills, cell phone accounts, mortgage or rent agreements, that would sort of give us sort of more micro data about sort of access to basic goods for women as well. I've looked a bit in the States and it's kind of problematic, but I'm much more interested, in more global sources as well. So I would invite you to comment on that if anyone has any insights. Thank you.
Hi, Ryan. Sure, I'll be happy to comment. I mean, there's this really interesting, for some years now, work have been done by UNSD. The World Bank has picked it up, others at American University at some point, to try to measure individual asset ownership disaggregated by sex. Because as you know, sort of the big problem is that usually the surveys are measuring sort of household assets, but how you can disaggregate those assets by individual, by sector. Are they picking up all these things? I mean, this is very time consuming, labor intensive work, but I would recommend there are some papers that the bank, for instance, has been publishing on is the asset ownership project, and it's coming out with sex disaggregated. I think, Carmen Diana Deer was here on the chat today. I think she has been doing some really interesting work, also disaggregate on things like land tenure, disaggregated by sex individual. But, there's a real issue in terms of attributing assets to individuals. There are real measurement issues. I mean, there was another question sort of on the chat in terms of women-owned and women-managed enterprises. There different institutions use different definitions, and it's a real challenge to try to harmonize a definition that will be internationally applicable. Thank you.
And next we have Teddy. Teddy, please go ahead.
Hi, I have a question from the perspective of someone who is an incoming graduate student in development economics and who also trained in data science. I personally feel as though I've been struggling to find opportunities that allow me to develop in the realm of feminist data science, much like you all have had the ability to develop over the years. And I was wondering if anyone had any sort of advice, any sort of recommendations, maybe any experiences that they could share from their own lives in regards to how they were able to get their foot in the door, because it seems like a world that's a little bit difficult to penetrate in terms of, when you're up and coming and you're a student, like training in these disciplines.
Yeah, who would like to respond to this concern? Sharda, would you want to say something about this?
Sure. I mean, I'm sure there are economists in departments of economics who would be able to say something about this. I mean, I think especially when you are a grad student and you're an emerging scholar, one of the ways that I found a way to grow is really to find people who are who would like to do this kind of data collection but do not have capacity, right? So that's where you're able to complement some of the some of your skills, and it is exactly on a topic where you're trying to develop your the feminist data science that you mentioned. And very often these are organizations or researchers that may not that are probably not very well resourced, right? So it's a sort of a tricky it's a sort of an interesting situation where you are able to give time, and they in turn give you a learning opportunity and to allow you to grow. But is there financial compensation? Is this the best use of your time? So I don't really have sort of easy answers, but I think a lot of international organizations do have internships, but I know a few years ago in the Canadian context, when banks, the federal bank opened up internships, they were not paid internships. The finance minister was actually talking about students don't need paid internships, you're getting experience, right? So it's because students are looking for opportunities to learn and to demonstrate that they have relevant experience, doesn't mean organizations that are doing well can actually exploit them in unpaid internships, right? So there are really a lot of issues around this. So it's not answering your question, but I'm thinking of the sort of context within which one can gain such experience.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Then we have two people putting up their question. We'll have Isabelle first, and then we have a question on chat by Gautami Pen. So Isabelle, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Maybe this is for the entire panel, so anybody who thinks it's relevant for them. I'm an anthropologist. I work in Haiti. I'm from Haiti. And one of my biggest concerns working in development specifically is, first, there's this mode of standardizing data. So agencies that unfortunately have a lot of influence over policy and how things get done in my country, they have this push for standardizing data, for working with the same kind of data or the same frameworks for data. And that becomes problematic because it's often not appropriate. So, right, so like kind of an example is what the World Bank is trying to do now with poverty lines, right, where they're trying to make it context specific versus just using the standard $2 a day, because that doesn't necessarily apply everywhere. So $2 a day in Haiti, that's not bad, actually. It's bad, but it's not as bad as you would think. And so there's the standardization of data, and then there's also just the data that informs the narrative that they want to push, right? So I think earlier you talked about the ILO definitions for employment, which I think is super interesting to talk about it as pay and or profit, because that sort of, I see it as encompassing a lot of different sectors. But then I worry about how, for instance, an agency like USAID defines a job, which is literally 1 day of 8 hours of labor of something like that. So in their programming and in their reporting, they report creating 40 jobs, even though it would have been like 20 people hired for 2 days. But that's, but it informs a narrative that is more beneficial for them versus actually talking about, these 20 people that we hired otherwise don't work. But over the course of 6 months, we hired them for 2 days. And that constitutes creation of 40 jobs. Do you see what I mean? So I don't know what experience maybe the panelists have had with this kind of, we'll just call it conflicting information. I'm just curious what kind of experiences you have on these kinds of issues.
I just want to jump in. I mean, I don't do research related to work, but it kind of keeps coming in the sort of research I do, right? I mean, I think the starting point is really that no data set is perfect. And I think Irene Van Stavarin mentioned this in her presentation, right? Each data or the method we are using actually captures a slice of reality. And we need to really piece them all together to be able to understand what's going on. So the context is really important, right? Your example of $2 in Haiti versus $2 elsewhere, I think it's really, I mean, it's such a simple example, and you would think, why is it then, international organizations, banks at all levels, why is it that they're not getting that logic, right? It's so simple. And I think the danger of relying exclusively or privileging one kind of data over the other, whether it's ethnographic data or quantitative data, is really that there is a certain idea of reality that is being presented, and everything else is then excluded, right? So in the Indian context, we don't have strong data on migration, internal migration. And therefore, when the Delta wave of COVID happened in last year, this time, why was the government taken by surprise? I mean, you would imagine with all the things that are happening that they should know and they should have been prepared. And I think one of the things, and I think all the panelists actually mentioned the need to engage policymakers consistently and keep doing it over and over and over and again, so they actually are attentive to these. But I think as researchers, for me, it is like, even if I'm working with a large data set, how do I understand the context? What are the things I need to do to understand the context so I can make better sense and use of this data, I think is really key.
Mayra, you want to respond?
Yeah, if I can add, and I agree very much with what you're saying, can add sort of from different stakeholders' perspectives, and now from a government perspective. I mean, and first, for some data has to be very context specific, right? Or customized, and very good example, I think, is when we're trying to measure agency, agency, sort of trying to get sort of a harmonized definition of agency is almost impossible, right? And it varies so much with the culture, the context. But on the other hand, and from a government perspective, particularly, standardization and harmonization really makes sense and makes things more efficient. And I'm going to give you the example. These different organizations, the World Bank, the ILO, the large agencies that produce data internationally, have yet to harmonize many data. And data on work and employment, the definitions that they use are often different. And then the results come out different. And then the countries, the country governments get the World Bank, LSMS survey comes with this kind of data, while the ILO labor service have slightly different figures. And it's, incredibly taxing, I think, for country governments that are managing all these different donor agencies and these international data producers that are coming up with different numbers for measuring the same thing. So I think that ultimately, in rationalizing things, standardizing things for policy making at country and international level makes sense. While on the other hand, obviously, if you want to do a sort of inside view on difficult concepts, you cannot go harmonized and standardize. You have to be very context specific and customized. Thank you.
Joanne, you want to say something or you have a question? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so we've heard from the panelists today about the efforts to improve the data resources, which often involve new variables, different variable definitions, and sometimes rethinking what should even be asked. And with the concerns for privacy that are spreading globally, and the use of new techniques like differential privacy, added to the fact that often the data sets that we use that are government based may be representative of a population on certain variables, but not the ones we're interested in. Have any of you all run into issues where privacy concerns and new privacy policies are taking away your access to the most interesting variables that you need to do your work, or are changing the access that you have?
If I can answer that question very briefly from the other side, Open Data Watch is an organization that publishes an open data inventory across countries in terms of how open and transparent data is in all different domains and across countries. And they have been doing this for gender data. And they find that, in fact, gender data of all the other domains, environment data, labor force, gender data is the least transparent and the least open. So I think we have a long ways to go and a big task ahead in terms of increasing the transparency and the openness of gender data. Thank you.
There's a question. Sorry.
I mean,
Please.
just to add to that, I think, the last 2 years, for a lot of people like me who do micro level ethnographic data, I mean, the challenges of access to or even accessing data comes from very different levels, right? World over, I think governments at different points, different governments are uncomfortable about putting out in public data that doesn't reflect them in good light, right? And like Mayra said, often it is related to gender. A lot of it is related to labor, unemployment rates. These sort of things are really don't reflect well on governments. So, and therefore, a lot of these data are, I think, increasingly becoming more difficult to access. And I think with COVID, a lot of us who could actually go out and do surveys or do our interviews, do ethnographies, while we were not able to access some of these data. So the challenges of doing really in-depth, rich research that actually addresses or tries to collect data on issues which are difficult to collect is actually becoming more challenging.
Thank you. So I will invite Lavanya to make her question. Dr. Irene has responded to it, but I would also like Dr. Deviki to respond to her question on bringing two methodologies together. Lavanya, would you like to put the question yourself?
I can't see myself. I would love to see myself. I seem to have vanished from the screen. Can you bring me back? Then I don't know what I've done.
We can't, but if you click on the video on the bottom left of your screen, then
Okay,
your video
never
will
mind.
turn back on. Yeah.
But can you hear me then?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the discussion and the panel. But it's been quite a broad range of issues. But I thought that valuing women in their role as both in economic, society, and politics, I thought was one of the central issues that, as an organizer, Shraddha or Jeannie, you raised. And therefore, to some extent, it was measuring and being able to get that thing across to who are the ones that measure and measure incorrectly. I mean, when they measure incorrectly, as they measure women's labor, our idea was to make sure that they measure it correctly. I think that's an important quest because many very important to women, especially to poor women, occupations like waste picking, mending clothes. There's a whole marketplace in Delhi where the women buy old newspaper and make gum out of some wheat and just make envelopes for the street vendors to use to put vegetables and things. And it's such a cheap, what is called low-cost envelope for these, and yet nobody has recognized that as an occupation. We call them envelope makers of some gully, but it's not considered an occupation. So I think we have a lot of work to do to improve the statistical system, both the definitions, the classification, the listing of what is work. I think that's an area which requires a constant effort by the group like this. We may have all done different things, but if we really have a focus, which of course many of us are ideologically driven by an idea that feminist economics is about justice, feminist economics is about visibilizing women's work in the economy, feminist economics is about changing the economic policy, then we can limit our focused work to those objectives. But we do go into a very broad range of issues, it's true. But I think in this forthcoming conference that we are having, one of the ideas I'm suggesting to Shraddha and others is, why not funnel it So out of it comes some determined action by Club of Feminist Economists, a group. Because earlier, we had a lot of collectivities when Mayra and I and some others who are not here, we worked as a group and we were really able to shake some of the international agencies, UNDP, ILO. I mean, we strategized because our idea was to knock it down, not only to publish papers, not only to say we did this, we found that, but there was a great desire to change the system or to change the policy or to change the measuring, change the way measures are made. And that seemed to be what I call a kind of attack on the current picture of data collection, definitions, and thereby program and policy and advocacy. I mean, how many of us have really focused on what is called that poor last woman and how to measure a contribution, how to make her contribution get less terrible and bring it up. I think Seva is doing something about that, but I think we need more to concentrate, personally, I feel, not only on gender, but on class. Class, and of course in other countries, race, in India, caste, something where we are preoccupied. We need to be preoccupied with justice, and the measuring needs to also speak to justice, I feel. Now, I mean, so many years of feminist economics have been going. Why not now try to make it strike where it should strike?
Thank you so much, Dr. Devaki. So, Dr. Irene, any final thoughts from you before you leave? Has she left? Okay.
Yeah, I believe both Irene and Mayra have to leave now, so maybe we can move to close.
Yeah, so thank you so much, all of you, for joining us and participating in the discussion. We had some fascinating discussion in the chat box too. I hope we try to cover most of it. And I think if we have more scope for discussion, the audience can reach out to our speakers. We would like to have this conversation going on, and on behalf of IAFFE committee, I invite all of you for our future events. Please keep in touch and keep posted and share your thoughts. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,